On a September morning in the year 821, the monastery at Howth on the Irish coast fell silent. The Annals of Ulster recorded what happened in just 11 words, cold and administrative, as if cataloguing livestock rather than lives. Ether was ravaged by the heathens, and many women were carried away into captivity. But behind those 11 words lay a horror that the chronicler either could not or would not describe in detail. These weren't peasant women taken from fields. These were the daughters of chieftains, the wives of nobles. Women who had woken that morning in halls where their families had ruled for generations. By nightfall they would be property, their names stripped away, their futures decided by men who spoke a language they couldn't understand, and followed laws that classified them as thrall, the lowest designation in Norse society, meaning less than human, meaning object, meaning merchandise. The journey across the Irish Sea was itself a kind of death, crammed into the belly of longships designed for speed rather than comfort. These women endured days of salt, spray, and sickness while their captors discussed their value the way farmers discuss cattle. Only the strongest survived the crossing. The weak, the elderly, the resistant. They were expenses that couldn't be justified, problems solved with brutal efficiency somewhere between the Irish coast and the Viking settlements that awaited those who reached land alive found themselves in Dublin, what we now call Dublin, which by the 820s had transformed into something unprecedented in Western Europe. It was a processing center for human cargo, a place where people became prices, where a healthy young woman of noble birth might fetch between 12 and 20 ounces of silver, the equivalent of what a small farm produced in an entire year. But the market in Dublin was just the beginning. Some women were purchased by Norse colonists, establishing themselves across Ireland, integrated into households where their skills in weaving, healing, and managing estates made them valuable beyond their bodies alone. Others were loaded onto ships again, transported to Hiddeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden. Great trading hubs where Scandinavian, Slavic, and Arab merchants conducted business in multiple languages and currencies. And some, perhaps the most tragic, were sold to Rus traders who moved them along the river routes deep into Eastern Europe, eventually reaching the massive slave markets of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, ending their days in places so distant from Ireland that they might as well have been on another world. The Annals of Ulster preserved no names from the raid of 800. The women of Howth became anonymous the moment they were taken, their identities deliberately erased, absorbed into an economic system that spanned from the fjords of Norway to the palaces of Baghdad. Yet sometimes a name survived. Around the year 956, in the reign of King Haakon of Norway, a wealthy Icelandic trader named Höskuldur Dalakolsson walked through a market examining merchandise. Among the goods offered by a Rus merchant named Kili was a young woman of extraordinary bearing, silent and dignified despite her circumstances. When Höskuldur asked her name, the merchant shrugged. He claimed not to know, said she hadn't spoken since he'd acquired her, struck by something he couldn't quite name, perhaps guilt, perhaps genuine fascination. Höskuldur paid 3 marks of silver for her 24 ounces, 3 times the value of a prime milk cow, an enormous sum that suggested either madness or instinct. He took her back to Iceland, to his farm, to his bed, and for years she remained silent, speaking to no one, not even to the son she bore him, a boy they named Alafor. Her silence was her fortress, the last territory she controlled in a life where everything else had been taken. If you value history that refuses to look away from the darkest chapters, please subscribe. These stories survive only because someone bothered to write them down, and they matter only if someone bothers to remember them. Your support keeps this work alive. Now, back to the woman who wouldn't speak. Years passed in Höskuldur's household, and the silent woman performed her duties, raised her son, and kept her secrets locked behind her teeth. Then one afternoon Höskuldur happened to walk past a stream on his property and heard something that stopped him cold. A voice, low and melodic, speaking words in a language he didn't understand. He moved closer and saw her, the woman he'd bought all those years ago, sitting by the water with young Alapfa, teaching him to speak Irish Gaelic, telling him stories in the tongue of her homeland. When he confronted her, the dam finally broke. Her name was Melkorka, and she was the daughter of Agatong, king of the Irish. Everything Höskuldur thought he knew about her was wrong, or rather, everything he'd assumed didn't matter had been the only thing that did. But knowing Melkorka's true identity changed nothing that mattered. She remained in Iceland, her status in the household perhaps slightly improved, but still fundamentally a possession rather than a person. She would die there, thousands of miles from the kingdom that should have been hers, while her son Alafor, later called Alafor the Peacock for his love of fine clothing, would grow to become a prominent chieftain who eventually sailed to Ireland with rich cargo, met his grandfather, the king, and was welcomed as royal kin. But Melkorka never returned. Her story, preserved in the Laxdæla saga, is one of the rare cases where a name survived the machinery of erasure, where we can point to a specific woman and say, here, this happened to her, she was real. For every Melkorka whose name we know, there were hundreds whose identities vanished completely, dissolved into the general category of captive, of thrall, of woman. The monastery at Coldingham in Northumbria understood what was coming. In the autumn of 870, the great heathen army, led by Ivar the Boneless, and Halfdan, sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, had been carving through England for 5 years, and now they turned north toward Scotland. Coldingham was a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns, perched on cliffs above the North Sea where the wind never stopped howling. The abbess, a woman named Gbe the Younger, had heard the stories from other monasteries that had fallen. She knew that for the women under her protection, capture meant something worse than death, a violation that in their worldview stained not just the body but the soul itself, an undoing of everything they'd devoted their lives to preserving. As the army drew closer, Gibby gathered her nuns in the chapter house and made a decision that would echo through the centuries. According to Matthew Paris's Flores Historiarum, written in the 13th century but drawing on older sources, she took up a razor and in front of her assembled community, cut off her own nose and upper lip, disfiguring herself so completely that her face became a mask of blood and ruined flesh. Then she commanded the other nuns to do the same. One by one they obeyed, each woman raising the blade to her own face and cutting away the features that might be seen as beautiful, transforming themselves into something the Vikings would find repulsive rather than desirable. The chapter house filled with blood and the sound of weeping, but not one woman refused. They had made their choice. When Ivor's warriors finally breached Coldingham's defenses and burst into the chapter house expecting to find cowering victims, they instead encountered a silent circle of women whose faces had been deliberately destroyed, who stared back at their would-be ravagers with a defiance that could not be mistaken. The Vikings' fury was immediate and total. Rather than accepting this theft of what they considered their rightful spoils, they sealed the doors, piled timber against the stone walls, and set the entire structure ablaze. The abbess and all her nuns burned alive inside, their choice honored in the worst possible way. They had not chosen between survival and death, but between two different kinds of endings, and they chose the flames over the alternative. Their bones mingled with ash and sank into the cliffside earth where no one would disturb them for centuries. The scale of these horrors becomes clearer when we look at the numbers. In 1011, a Danish force under Thorkel the Tall besieged Canterbury for 20 days until betrayal from within opened the gates. The Vikings seized Archbishop Lafia, the royal Reeve Glefgar, the Abbess Leofruna of St. Mildred's, and Bishop Godwine of Rochester, along with much of the city's noble population. The women were kept alive specifically as bargaining chips, their lives measured against the silver that might be extracted from King Lelred's treasury. For months they endured captivity while negotiations proceeded. Archbishop Lafia refused to allow ransom to be paid for himself, declaring the church's silver should not be wasted on his release, and in April 1012, drunken warriors murdered him with an axe at Greenwich. But the women remained valuable, and eventually a staggering payment of £48,000 of silver, an almost unimaginable sum, purchased the withdrawal of Thorkel's army and presumably the release of the captives. Their freedom wasn't won by mercy or negotiation but by arithmetic. Their lives weighed on scales against ingots of precious metal, their suffering reduced to a line item in a national transaction. The genetic evidence tells its own story. Modern DNA studies of Iceland's population reveal that while the overwhelming majority of founding fathers carried Norse ancestry, approximately 63% of founding mothers traced their roots to Ireland and Scotland. The Landnámabók, Iceland's Book of Settlements, doesn't hide this fact. It records plainly that men like Ingamanda the Old sent their followers on raids to Ireland, and that these men returned with captive women who became the wives and concubines of Iceland's first families. These women were the foundation upon which an entire nation was built, their bodies and labor and children forming the bedrock of Icelandic society. Yet their names mostly vanished from the record, absorbed into genealogies that celebrated their captors while erasing their own stories. They were remembered only as foremothers, never as individuals, their voices silenced before they could speak. Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from the Asuberg ship burial, discovered in 1904 near Oslo. Within this magnificent vessel, dated by tree rings to the summer of 834, lay two women. The elder, between 70 and 80 years old, her bones showing evidence of advanced cancer, was clearly a person of immense power, possibly a queen or priestess. For generations, scholars assumed the younger woman, around 50 years old, was simply her attendant, but recent DNA analysis revealed something troubling. The younger woman's genetic markers are exceptionally rare in Scandinavia, instead appearing most commonly around the Black Sea and into regions of Iran. Isotopic analysis of her bones shows she ate a low-protein diet for most of her life, consistent with those distant regions, but in her final years her diet suddenly changed to match the protein-rich meals of Norse nobility. She was brought to Norway, perhaps as a captive, perhaps purchased in trade, and placed in the household of the Oseberg queen. When her mistress died, so did she, whether by choice or compulsion we cannot know. Her body was included in that spectacular burial not as an honor to herself but as evidence of her owner's wealth and power. Even in death, she remained property. The splendor of the Oseberg ship was never meant for her. She was just one more offering, one more possession displayed to mark the greatness of the woman who owned her. These weren't side stories in the Viking Age, they were central to how that society functioned, how it expanded, how it built itself across the North Atlantic and beyond. The women carried away from Ireland, Scotland, England, and lands even farther east were the invisible infrastructure of Norse expansion. their labor and children and forced assimilation creating the population that sustained settlements from Dublin to Iceland to the Rus territories. The chronicles record their capture in numbers, women by the dozens, by the hundreds, but rarely by name. They became anonymous the moment they were taken, their identities dissolved into the general categories of thrall and concubine and wife. Their voices lost to history except in rare cases like Melkorka, where a saga author bothered to preserve what happened. We celebrate the Viking Age for its exploration and artistry and dramatic sagas, but we must also remember that it was built on the systematic enslavement and erasure of countless women whose names we will never know, whose suffering funded the ships and settlements and silver hoards we now display in museums. Their silence echoes through every artifact we uncover, every burial we excavate, every saga we translate. They are the foundation we don't want to see, the cost we prefer not to calculate. What strikes you most about these stories? The systematic nature of it, the rare acts of resistance, or the fact that so many names were lost forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. History isn't just about remembering the victors. Sometimes it's about refusing to forget the forgotten.